So welcome to the Advanced Data Tools webcast series. I think this is the last one of the calendar year. And we're going to be talking about Dostats and update statistics in general. So a lot of this material has been gone over before. I did a similar webcast a few years ago, but the focus of that one was on update statistics and auto update statistics. And towards the end, I think I reviewed some of the Dostats options. Our focus this time is kind of reversed. We're going to spend most of our time looking at all of the Dostats options, some of which are kind of esoteric, but they're all there for a reason because they all came out of some specific need that I had or that somebody suggested. So let's jump into it. Okay, hang on. There we go. Okay. So this is our agenda. We'll review all that Dostats does. We'll take a look quickly at how you can use Dostats to replace auto update statistics. We'll take a look at Drive Dostats, which is a script that lets you run multiple copies of Dostats in parallel to get the stats for your database built quite a bit faster if your machine has the horsepower for it. And then we'll just talk about, if we have time, we'll talk about update statistics in general. Okay. So for those few who are not familiar with it, Dostats is my utility that implements all the recommended guidelines in the Informix Performance Guide for how to build usable data distributions for your database in reasonable time. Okay. As we'll talk about later, the best distributions you can build will always be high statistics on every single column um, with a very high resolution. Okay, and that will get you the best performance, the best distributions. But on a large table, on a large database, that can be very expensive to calculate. So we try and balance the time and resources needed to build the distributions with the quality of the distributions and how they improve the performance of your queries. Okay. Dostats itself is the most powerful update statistics tool out there. I say that with no um, modesty at all. I built it. I like it. A lot of other people seem to like it, so I'm going to make that claim. I do know that it uses less overhead and has a lesser effect on your server's performance while it's running than AUS does. Okay. And I think that the algorithms it uses are just a little bit better than the ones that were written for AUS. So let's take a look at the parameters. Okay. Um, these parameters have to do with the PDQ priority that Dostats runs under. If you run Dostats with PDQ priority that's positive, when you build the distributions for your tables, it will typically run faster. Okay, just because the engine will be doing things in parallel. But you don't ever want to compile your stored procedures with a positive PDQ priority because they will always execute with that PDQ priority and not the user's effective PDQ priority. So by default, if your environment variable, PDQ priority environment variable is set, or you use the -Q option here to set a PDQ priority that's non-zero, then when Dostats begins to recompile your stored procedures to run update statistics for the procedures, it will reset the PDQ priority to 0 by default. You can specify with the -P option a PDQ priority to use when compiling your stored procedures. If there are certain procedures for which it's important that they run with a specific PDQ priority, you can do that. Either by setting, by using the -P option. Setting PDQ priority in the environment will not do that for you because Dostats will explicitly set it to 0 before compiling the procedures to keep you from shooting yourself in the foot. Okay. Also, The dash Q will use the AUS PDQ priority threshold that's stored in the sysadmin database if you pass the AUS thresholds option, which we'll talk about a little more later. Okay. So you don't have to necessarily pass dash Q or set the environment. If you want to use what AUS uses, just pass the dash AUS dash thresholds. Okay. Dash H lets you specify a server, so you don't have to run Dostats against the default server. You can specify a different server to run against. It should be a network or a stream pipe connection. If you need to use a shared memory connection, you must use the dash capital S option to tell Dostats not to try to connect to two different databases at once. By default, it will connect to the sysmaster database to get a list of matching databases so that you can run Dostats against multiple databases, which we'll talk about in a slide or two. But if you need to use a shared memory connection, it can't do that because it also has to connect to the database that it's running against. So you pass dash S that says don't bother to check out sysmaster. Just run for the database that I specify on the command line, which we're getting to. Okay. Optionally, you can tell Dostats to set explain on so that you can get an sqexplain.out file, which will give you a listing of all the commands that Dostats ran to get the information that it wanted to get. So if you want to build your own, go right ahead. That's where you'll get some of the queries you can use. It'll also tell you if there are any bottlenecks in running those queries. Okay. So as I said, you can pass dash D and a database spec, which is a matches wildcard or just a database name. So you can say dash D, dash D art, and it will run for the art database. Or you can say dash DS star in quotes, and it will run for every database that starts with the letter S. Okay. Same thing with the table spec. By default, if you specify a database or a list of databases, write a wildcard for databases, it will run for every table, every stored procedure, everything in the database. But optionally, you can specify dash T and a wildcard spec for the table name, and it will run only against those tables. And if you do that by default, it does not do compile stored procedures, but you can add that optionally. With the dash P option. Okay, so that's if you don't specify dash T, it only does procedures. If you by default, if you just put the database in, it's like doing dash P dash T star. Okay, do procedures and do tables. It will just do everything. Okay, with the dash P option, you can specify dash include owner, which will include the owner names of the procedures when it tries to compile the stored procedure, which you'll need to do if you have any stored procedures that are named after existing keywords. So if you have an old procedure, named partition in your database, that may fail if it's not qualified with the owner name. If that wasn't from an old system, but now that's a keyword, so you couldn't do that. So that option is there for that reason. Okay. Dash N followed by a number tells Dostat not to quit if it reaches an error, if it encounters an error doing the update statistics, but only if the number of errors it's encountered exceeds that threshold that you specify with dash N. Okay. If you also specify dash error dash count, Dostats will return the number of errors in the return code, assuming it fits in the eight bits that come back with the error code, so that you can kind of script and report how many errors you got, at least under certain circumstances. Okay. By default, Dostats does not process the system catalog tables. It only processes user tables, but you can specify dash M, and it will process the system catalog tables as well as all of the user tables. Okay. Dash W in a number of seconds sets wait mode, sets lock wait mode to n seconds. Okay. so that if it encounters a table that is locked for some reason, it will wait and that number of seconds before it times out. The dash A aging option, dash A and dash capital A, which specifies the number of days for aging, which defaults to 30 days. Okay, so that only updates statistics on tables that are older than that number of days old. Okay, aging can also use the AUS aging threshold if you have that set in AUS. Okay. If you again pass dash dash AUS thresholds. Okay, so you don't necessarily need the capital A. This is the browsing mode, which was put in long ago. It is no longer necessary because of Autostat Mode. The behavior of Autostat Mode came out of me having this browsing mode in there for Dostats. And when John Miller built AUS, he thought this was a good idea, so he built it into the server, which is great. So you really don't need to use the browsing option any longer if you enable Autostat Mode. Okay. As I said, AUS thresholds tells Dostats to use the thresholds that were set for AUS in the pH thresholds table in sysadmin. The 4 defined thresholds are AUS age, which is the aging default, AUS change, which is the default for stat change. Okay, if a table doesn't have one set. Okay, and AUS PDQ is the default PDQ priority, and AUS small tables defines what a small table is. Okay, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Okay. By default, and as it's running, it tells you what it's doing. So it will say things to standard error like running for this database, running for this table medium, running for this table low, running for these columns high. If you pass in dash E or dash capital E, it will also report the timings for each of those steps, how long each step took. Okay. By default, the dash E reports in fractional seconds. The dash capital E reports in hours, minutes, and fractional seconds. Okay. So 1 minute rather than 60 seconds. Dash dash time display displays the start time for each command and each block of commands in UTC. All right, best used obviously with dash E, one of the dash E options. If you want the time in local time, you can do dash dash display local instead, and it will display it based on your current time zone. Okay. Dash dash procedure. This is part of how you can automate your update statistics into the task manager in the engine. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. So if you do dash dash procedure equals name, Dostats will create a stored procedure named name, whatever name you pass in, and will create the procedure and load all of the commands that the procedure has to execute into a table by default in the sysadmin database. Okay. If you pass dash F file path, it will put the commands into a file so that you can execute them later. Okay. At a later time, kind of use Dostats as an evaluator, like the AUS evaluator. If you want to see more information on what Dostats is doing, or less information about what Dostats is doing for scripting, the dash V option lets you set the verbosity of the standard error output. Okay. Dash dash execute local. As I said, if you do dash dash procedure, the proc is put by default in sysadmin and it executes in sysadmin, accessing your tables remotely from that database when it runs. Okay, when you execute the procedure. But if you want, you can say dash dash execute local, okay, and it will store and create the procedure in the local database. Okay. And dash dash proc local also puts the table with the commands to execute into each database rather than putting them in sysadmin. Okay, these are required for ANSI mode databases and unlogged databases in the older servers before 1170. Okay. because you could not run, since sysadmin was a logged database, you couldn't execute commands in an unlogged database against an unlogged database or against an ANSI mode database because it was Informix mode logged. Okay. -- schedule lets you schedule the stored procedure that Dostats creates in the task manager directly. And the subflags -- frequency -- first time, last time, one time let you specify how that scheduling happens. If you don't also specify -- procedure and give this procedure a name, Dostats will create a default name for you. Okay. All the tasks that it registers are in task group Dostats in PH task, so you can find them easily. All right, so here you can see you can specify run on weekdays, run on Sundays, on Mondays, run on the first of the month, the second of the month. Okay, first run at a specific time, but don't run after another specific time. And then the one-time flag says, after you execute the procedure this one time, don't put it back in the schedule or disable it. So it will actually still be in PH task, but it will be disabled after the first time it runs. If you don't pass in -- one time, it will register for the procedure to run periodically based on the frequency you specify over and over again. So daily, weekly, monthly. Okay. Now that we have stat change, you have the option to override the default Autostat mode. Okay, if Autostat mode is on, then tables whose stats are not stale, basically there haven't been enough changes to the table to exceed the threshold of the stat change value, either the default one for the system or the specific stat change that you've set on your individual tables, then the update statistics commands that Dostats run will all be no up. If you want Dostats to run regardless, no matter what, so for example, when I set up a system, I have Dostats running usually out of a cron every day, but every day, let's say one day, Saturday or Sunday, it will run with the -- force run option so that the stats are never more than 1 week old. They never get stale, basically. And then on the days in between, we run without force run, which is the equivalent of running with -- auto run, so that only tables that are really active and have exceeded their stat change will get updated again. Okay, so that's how you do that. -- isolation tells Dostats what isolation level to use when it's gathering the information it needs and when it's executing commands. So that can avoid some locking situations in very, very busy databases. Okay. It's usually not necessary to set your own isolation level. By default, it runs under committed read, but it is an option that you can set. Okay. Now, the next series of options let you adjust the update statistics commands that Dostats will run. So for example, --R lets you set the resolution for the update statistics high commands that Dostats is running, which is the percent of data, the percentage of rows that are in each high bucket, right? So by default, high runs with 40 buckets, okay, with --R 25 is the equivalent, 2.5 rather, I'm sorry, --R 2.5. So you can change that if you want a higher resolution, if you want a finer resolution, you can do that, okay, and using the --R. Similarly, for medium stats, the --R sets the resolution for medium stats, which defaults to fewer buckets. So you may need, rather than go to high for a particular table, you may want to run it with a higher resolution with more buckets so that the data is a little better. You can also change the confidence level, which is the probability that the medium stats are as good as high. The default, I believe, is 90%. You can set it to anything from 80 to 99%. Okay. And then the fairly new option in the later versions of Informix is the -Z, which lets you set the sampling size. Um, by default, medium stats sample the data, and they sample a relatively small number of rows. I believe they never samples more than 400,000 rows, no matter how big the table is. Okay, and on an even a million record row table, it's only sampling a couple of thousand rows. So if you want more, a finer sampling quality, so that again your medium stats are closer to being a high without the overhead of actually doing a high, you have two choices. If you do -Z with a number greater than 1, that's treated as an absolute number of rows to sample. If you do -Z with a number less than 1, then that is considered a percentage of rows in the table. Okay, so any table, let's say if you do -Z 0.1, okay, then it will sample 10% of the rows in the table, regardless of how big or small the table is. Okay. Dash dash drop distributions, which is very important to use the first time you run Dostats after upgrading, of doing a version upgrade, or setting up a new server. Which drops the existing distributions that are saved for the whole database, deletes them all, so that you're running Dostats now with a clean slate, okay, and empty sysdistrib and sysfragdist tables. Okay, don't use dash dash drop distributions with drive Dostats, because you're running multiple copies of Dostats, each of which will drop all the distributions. So other copies may have already started writing new ones in, and you will wipe them out. Okay. For that, we have dash dash clean distributions, which deletes the distributions for each table as it begins the work on that table, and that's safe to use with drive Dostats. Okay. Rather than dropping them out of the whole database. Dash F is an option I put in because some very busy servers do better without what's called the single column optimization. So one of the recommendations in John Miller's papers on the subject of update statistics several years ago was that when you do an update statistics high, you're typically doing distributions only. Okay, you're doing the high with the distribution, so you don't have to do a low. Okay, but with the dash F optimization, it does the you get separate high with distributions only and a low on the same column as separate commands. Sometimes in some circumstances that's faster, so the option is here. By default, it just doesn't update statistics high on single column indexes without the distributions only clause. Okay. The next series of options are ways for you to specify specific tables that you want Dostats to work on. Okay, it gives you more flexibility and more control than -T does, because -T just lets you specify one table name or one wildcard. Okay, with the -I option, you have several possibilities. You can pass in a table name. Okay. And you can have multiple -I options. So -I table Fred, -I table Wilma, -I table Barney. Okay, you can have multiple -Is and that way specify multiple tables. You can also specify -I at a file path, and in that file you can put the list of tables you want processed by that copy or that instance of Dostats, one per line, and it will process those tables that are in the file. Similarly, you can do -I exclamation point followed by a where clause or by a full select statement. Okay, so where the select statement returns table names. So if you specify a where clause, Dostats will take that string and build a query that says basically select tab name from systables where, whatever you specify. Okay. And the same thing with the -I and the select, except that you provide an entire select statement that returns table names. And that can be fairly complex. Okay. So one of the things is if you don't normally need a dash T option, if you have a dash I option, if you do specify them, the tables listed by dash T that succeed with dash T and the ones that are included by dash I are ORed together. Okay. So if you can do that dash T none, that's a special case where dash T basically doesn't do anything. Okay. And it just uses whatever's in the include list. Similarly, we have the dash X options. With dash X, you can exclude a database. Okay, so do all the databases that were specified by the dash D option, except this one. Okay, so I can do, dash D S star, and that might do sysmaster and sysadmin and sysuser and et cetera, et cetera. But if I wanted to not do, specifically not do sysusers, I could do dash X sysuser : and that would exclude sysuser from the databases that are processed based on the dash D spec. Okay, and again, you can put the names of the database of tables not to process in a file, okay, or dash X table name to exclude those tables, even though they might be in the dash T list, okay. And same thing with a where clause. There's no option with dash X to specify a whole select because it's just really easy to reverse the where clause in your select statement with a dash I to specify the list of tables that don't include the ones you don't want to process. So I just didn't bother implementing it. Okay. Be very careful though, if you mix dash I and dash X options, you might not get what you expect to get. Okay. Dash capital G, normally Dostats makes decisions about row counts, and it normally does that by going to the SMI tables in sysmaster. But in some very large databases with lots and lots of tables and lots of DB spaces, that query can be very slow. And also because Dostats does that for every table in the server, even if you're only processing one or two tables with dash T. So the dash capital G option just uses a select count star on the individual tables to get the row counts it needs to make some decisions. Okay. So that can be faster under certain circumstances. Dash W, I've repeated here. I must have forgotten I put it on the other slide. Dash F I mentioned already, puts the results in the output file. Okay, did this. Oh, dash capital N. Normally when Dostats runs update statistics for a procedure, it adds the specific keyword because it's going to be processing the same. If a function name is overlaid with multiple signatures, Dostats doesn't normally recognize that, and it will run the same procedure name multiple times. Each time it runs it, the engine will compile all of the matching procedures, not just one. So by default, Dostats adds the specific keyword, and that prevents it from doing that. If you do dash capital N, it does not. It avoids using the specific keyword. Okay. Dash lower G treats columns that are used in fragmentation expressions as if they lead an index and basically does a high on them, even if they don't. It wouldn't otherwise do a high. Okay. Because the optimizer needs to have some information about the fragmentation scheme when it's making decisions about whether to use an index or rely on fragment elimination to speed up a particular query, this can improve some queries. So it is an option. It's not done by default. Okay. These options let you take complete control of what Dostats is doing. If you include any of them, Dostats doesn't do anything else. Okay, with whatever exceptions are here on the slide. So if you do dash capital L, it runs only lows with drop distributions first. And if you do up to lower L, it does only lows but doesn't do the drop distributions part. If you do dash T, it only does medium level stats on those columns that don't lead indexes. If you add dash capital I, it does high on the first columns of indexes and first column that's different from one index to another. And dash capital C to do the low on each individual whole index key, okay, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Dash dash small tables high. So like AUS, you can tell Dostats that if a table is tiny, just do high on all the columns. It's easier, it's faster, and it's not going to take much time. Okay. And you can specify with dash dash small tables threshold the number of rows that constitutes a small table. By default, Dostats uses 0. AUS's default for small tables is 100 rows. And again, with dash dash AUS thresholds, you can tell the small table process to use the thresholds from AUS, whatever is set there. And you may have changed that from 100, but whatever it is. So here you can say a small table is a table with 10,000 rows, not 100. But by default, small tables are 0, so only empty tables are processed as small, and they don't get any distributions anyway. Okay. Dash dash distributions high file. This is one I had to do for a specific client of mine that had certain columns that were used as filters in queries, but were not leading any index. But having high distributions on those columns improved performance for a subset of their queries significantly. So for them, we have this option. Dash dash distributions high file lets you specify the path of a file that contains a list of columns that have to get high no matter what. Okay, so the database will, the Dostats rather, will add those column names to its list of columns to do as high and remove them from its list of columns to do as low during its analysis phase. Okay. So the file contains 3 columns: the database name, the table name, and the column name, white space separated. One table per, one column rather per line. Okay. And they don't have to be in any particular order. Dostats sorts all that out for you. Just throw in the columns. If you have a new column to add, you don't have to find the right place to put it. Just throw it at the end of the file, and Dostats will take care of that for you. Okay. Any questions before we move on to the next part of this? Okay. Mark, what's 2973? Or were you just chatting, typing on your keyboard?
Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, that's what medium will sample. At least back in the day, that's the number.
Oh, okay.
I only remember it because I taught it so much. So yeah, I think that's the number. Who knows?
I think they boosted it up, but but that was the limit at one point. It didn't get much higher. They never pushed it much higher.
I thought you would enjoy seeing that.
Yep. Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, moving on. So now let's talk about AUS. Okay, you can use Dostats instead of AUS, of course. You can use it manually. You can stick it in your cron, right? You can create a stored procedure to run through the task manager that physically runs Dostats, using system, right? Using the system shout out to run Dostats external to the database. But there is a methodology by which you can tell Dostats to replace AUS and set itself up to run the same way that AUS runs. Okay, we'll just be using Dostats as both the evaluator, and we'll use a stored procedure to process the results, the list of commands to execute that the evaluator builds. Okay, if you have 11, 10, and most of 1150, this is a very important thing to be able to do because the AUS evaluator before 11.7 was very slow and used a tremendous amount of resources. It was rewritten in 1170 so that it was not nearly as slow. It was much better, but it still used a lot of resources. A second pass through it in the later versions of 11.7 improved that also, so it is better than it was, but I think Dostats is still less overhead and gets the job done faster. So there's an option, and I just think it does a better job, but we'll talk about that. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is disable AUS tasks, which you can do in the sysadmin database. Just update PH task, set TK enable to F to false, where TK name matches auto space star. Okay. Obviously, you might want to search first to make sure there are no new tasks that got into the database called AutoStar. But as of the last time I checked, those only the two auto update stats tasks start with that string. Okay. Um, if you go to my blog page, which is informix-myview.blogspot.com, the May 5th, 2011, I posted a bunch of shell scripts you can use to simplify this process. There's setupstats.k shell that sets up all this for you. Evaluate stats.k shell that does an eval, and initial stats that just sets things up, also helps set things up. Okay. So you can download those and help you set this up. Basically, if you do that, you'll need to modify setupstats.k shell so that it has a start time and an end time, which are up at the top of the script. They're variables that you can set. Okay, and make sure that the start time is at least an hour before I'm sorry, that the e-start time is at least an hour before the start time. That's the time. E-start time is the time the evaluator kicks off, and start time is the time for the actual update stats runs. You want to allow enough time in between for the evaluator to complete. Okay, and you can tell that by just doing a do stats run and having it write to a file. However long that takes, that's a good you know, ballpark number to use for the gap between those two start times. Okay. Also, in evaluate stats, you need to modify the path to find the file in the line that starts with let cmd equals. Okay, there's a dot space environment script execution in there that sets up the environment for the script, so it can run in cron if it has to. You need to change it to whatever environment script you use. Okay. Also, by default, the script sets up to run PDQ priority 100. If you want to drop that down, you can modify that there in the script. Okay. And if you're running the early versions of 11.10 and 11.50, do the -- local proc if you have ANSI mode or unlogged databases to process. All right. Run that. For each database you want to process, it takes 2 arguments, the name of the database and a directory to write log files to, so that when it runs, you get log files. Okay. Make similar changes to the evaluate stats and to initial stats as you did for setup, and optionally initialize your stats to a known state by running the initial stats script. Okay, it takes the same 2 arguments, database name and a log file path. And that will run an initial set of stats to set things up, okay, so that you have a known state. Okay. You can also, by the way, use the initial stats script to put your distributions in a known state and let AUS pick them up and maintain them going forward. But that's not 100% the same as using DoStats. We'll talk about that later. There's one thing that AUS doesn't do that DoStats does that AUS won't do even if you prime the pump by setting the distribution levels previously. Okay. Let's see. If you're running in early versions of Informix that don't have Task Manager, you can use cron. Okay. I have scripts I can send you. Email me and I'll send them to you. If you're still using 7 or 9 or 10, I can send you some scripts that you can use to do this and have the equivalent of AUS running without AUS, right, without a Task Manager. Okay. So why do this? Why replace AUS with DoStats? Because as I said, even in 1170 and 12, DoStats is a faster evaluator than AUS and does use fewer resources, and the resources it uses are not inside the database. So it's not keeping your ONANETs busy. right, doing the calculations. It's doing it external to the database, where it might be running in additional cores that are not available to the engine. You might even be running Dostats on a separate system. Okay, so it might have almost no impact on the server at all. Okay, if the server doesn't, here's an example from my system. I ran AUS. It took 33 seconds to run on a specific database on my system, but Dostats did the same work in 19 seconds. So it's about a third faster. Okay, and that holds true no matter how big the database is. It is always about a third faster than the latest versions. It's much faster than the older versions. Okay. What else? AUS server uses CPU VP resources. Dostats is independent. Okay. AUS runs thousands of queries to get its job done. For every table, it runs a bunch of queries. Dostats runs basically 3 little queries to set itself up. One query to get the list of tables and columns, another query to get the list of stored procedures, and a third one if there are fragmented tables that need to be looked at. Done. And that's if you pass in-G. So basically it runs 5 or 6 queries. So it's a lot less intensive on the server than AUS is, okay, even in the newer versions. Here's the big problem for me, is that AUS does not perform the low operation on each full index key. Okay, I got this idea way back when from one of the optimizer engineers who built the original optimizer, and it works for me. There is a debate. Some of the engineers think this is unnecessary. John Miller certainly did. Others agree with me that you have to do it. All I know is if I go into a client site and they're having problems and their statistics otherwise look good, but AUS has been gathering them, I run Dostats. The stats look the same, but they work better. And I think it's because of the low, because that's the only real difference that I've been able to detect. So I just think this is an important step that AUS does not do. Okay. Questions about AUS and replacing AUS? Okay. Drive Dostats. So as I said, Drive Dostats is a script. It comes in my utils2 AK package along with Dostats and my schema and DB schema DB struct and SQL struct and a few other utilities. And what it does is it breaks up the list of tables in your database into n sublists of tables, and runs n copies of Dostats in parallel, each of which has been given a list of tables to process, using the -I file option basically, and runs them as a background task. Okay. Tables are sorted by size. By default, they're sorted descending, but you can optionally sort them ascending. So it processes all the small tables first. Normally, it processes all the big tables first. So if you run, let's say, if you tell Drive Dostats to run 3 copies of Dostats, each one will so you'll basically, the first 3 biggest tables will be processed first by those 3 different instances, then the next 3 biggest tables, and the next 3 biggest tables, and the next 3 biggest tables, okay? Or the reverse of that, the smallest and the next smallest and the next smallest. And basically you get your job done a whole lot faster, although it will use more resources. You have to have the horsepower and cycles available to do that, okay? So here's what the command line looks like. Drive Dostats, the number of processes to run, the name of your database, a file spec. Optionally, you can give it -X and -I options of your own, okay? But you can't use the SQL, the where clause and SQL options, just because the script doesn't recognize them to pass them through. Okay, I've never gone back to the script and modified it to do that. But you can do -X table name or -X at file name, right, or etc., and get that done. Okay. And optionally -A reverses the sort order, and that's pretty much it. You can also pass any other Dostats options that you want to pass. So for example, you can do, dash capital P 50 to run, or dash capital P5 and run 20 copies of Dostats with PDQ party 5 each, right, and suck up the whole system if you want. Okay. Here's some runtime examples from my system on a fairly small database. Dostats running once took about 2.5 seconds to run. On another database, with the same database with 4 copies of Dostats using drive Dostats, it took under 2 seconds. Okay, about a 30% improvement. On a larger database, it took 5.5 seconds to run, but drive Dostats with 10 instances on a 2-core machine knock that down to under a second, okay, under 3/4 of a second, so 600% improvement. So you can get your stats done a whole lot faster by running them in parallel, again, if you have the cycles available to do that without screwing things up and causing problems for other applications. Any questions about drive Dostats? Cool. All right. Let's talk quickly about update statistics. So if you look in the performance guide, it tells you what the recommended protocol is. And the protocol is, let's see, there we go. The protocol is to do an update statistics high on the first column of each index key with distributions only option. Do a high distributions only for the first column in the index key list that's different when 2 indexes start with the same list of columns. So if you have an index on A, B, and C and an index on A, B, and D, you need to do highs on column A because it's the leader of both of those indexes, and on C and D because they are different. Okay, the third column is different. The second column is the same, so you don't need to do column B. Okay, B can stay in the list of medium. Then you can do the performance guide says do an update statistics medium on all other columns, okay, and do an update statistics low on the full key of each index, right, as I recommended. Okay. Now 11.7, they improved how the server processes update statistics. Okay, so new distributions are calculated. This is with the stat change and the auto, the Autostat Mode. Okay, that the tables are haven't reached certain thresholds of being modified. Nothing happens. It's no op. Okay. You can set stat change in the onConfig file as a default. You can also set it as an attribute of any table in the database. So you can have a stat change default to 10%, but another table that's fairly quiet, you can say, well, I want that at 5%, right? Or a very, very large table, you might set stat change at 1%. Okay. All right. Since 11.10, since 11.10, create index produces high distributions, but only on the first column of the index that it's creating. Okay, so that's good. It's better than nothing. But if you have several indexes that start with the same column or include the same list of columns in different orders, that may not be enough quality stats for the optimizer to make good decisions. Okay, so you still need to run update statistics, even right after creating an index, right on a loaded table. Okay. So we talked about AUS, so I'm going to skip over this. Okay. So in the later versions of 11.7 and 12, they improved the scan algorithm that's used for low stats in 2 different ways. And one is that they just improved the way they do that scan. But in order for that to happen, you have to have auto read ahead set to 1. Okay. And that can be 1 comma a threshold value. And that's much faster than the old sampling. Okay. You also have to set UST low sample use statistics low sample to 1 and you're on config. Okay. Or you can use on mode to do that. And that's it. That's all we've got to talk about. All right. We will have more webcasts coming up. Lester, I don't know what you already have planned.
Actually, we don't have anything planned yet, Art. And if anybody has suggestions, I'd love to hear them.
Probably why I don't know. All right. So we also have training coming up. Did somebody say something?
I just put something in the chat, Art.
Oh, say. Considered a throttle. Turn down. It would be a good idea, but it's too complex to implement. Drive do stats is just a script, so it doesn't have a lot of intelligence and a lot of access to how busy the system really is. But basically, what it does is it launches three or four or n copies of do stats and just lets them run. Unlike the parallel execution that I do in my export, which actually launches one export at a time or n exports at a time and relaunches the next one as they peter out, as they finish. This is just a one-shot deal, so we don't have a lot of control. But it's something to think about. If I can figure out a way to do it, I might just do it. Thank you, Mark. All right, so we have training coming up. Lester and I will be doing the advanced performance tuning course again in March. We already have a few people registered, so that course will happen. Right, we never cancel a course if somebody's registered.
And the last one last year filled up, and I hate to say it, when people get mad at me because they can't register, I can't do anything about it.
Right, we only have so many machines available, and we want to make sure everybody has their own machine to run on. Some people have suggested we just set up cloud machines, but our experience is that virtual machines and cloud machines, the performance of those machines is just not consistent enough for the kind of benchmarking that we're trying to teach.
Yeah, I just did an advanced class, and part of it is doing benchmarks and measuring what changes made. And on the cloud, you can't get reliable performance.
There you go. No. So we're limited to the number of machines we can fit in Lester's data center. So there we go.
Hey Art, mentioned in your blog spot there are some scripts or something, but I couldn't find it. Is there a specific place I can direct us?
Send me an email and I'll send you the specific link.
Sure. No
All right.
problem. Thank you.
It was the May 2011 blog entry.
Oh, it's in May 2000.
Yeah, May 2011. But send me and if you don't find it, send me an email and I'll send you the link.
Okay, no worries. Sure. Thank you.
Or the scripts, or I'll just
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you.
Also in April, we're doing the basic database administrator class. So if you have new people on board that you need to bring up to speed, DBAs that were not Informix people that need to understand the differences between, Oracle, Postgres, and need to learn Informix, then we're doing that in April and again in September. Or Lester usually teaches those classes. But they will be available. All right. That's it. Oh, when we do the classes, this is the training room. So as you can see, we have a limited number of systems available.
Yeah, we have eight servers, 4 for people who can attend in class, and then 4. Well, actually, all of them can be used for online attendees.
Right. So as Lester's pointing out, you can attend the class remotely. You don't have to come down to Virginia. to attend the class. We've done the class for people in New Zealand and Australia and all over the world. So it is possible to attend remotely without having to fly down to Virginia or up to Virginia.
Like the one last few days I did for a group in India. And so I stayed up all night and taught it on India time. It was a lot of fun.
Yep. All right. But if you can get down to Virginia, this is the day. This is the training room. So we can house 4 people in the training room and another 4 remotely for a total of 8, or 8 up to 8 remote. All right. And there you go. Thank you, everybody.
Hey,
Russ,
thank you, Art. No. Thank you very much, Art.
You're welcome.